The fork paused halfway to his mouth across the candlelit room, behind a screen of hothouse lilies and the slow drift of violin smoke. He saw her, his wife, 7 months gone with his child, her hand resting on the white linen as if she had placed it there to steady the world, and across from her leaning in, with the unhurried courtesy of a man who had never in his life been refused anything, sat the Duke of Marinwall. Lord Adrian Vesh set the fork down. The small click of silver against porcelain was to his ear louder than the orchestra. He had a few seconds to decide whether to stand, whether to cross the room, whether to pretend he had not seen at all. He did none of those things. He breathed out through his nose, and he watched. Beside him, Morel laughed at something he had not said, a bright laugh meant to be overheard, and her gloved fingers brushed the cuff of his sleeve in the proprietary way she had been practicing for 3 months now. He felt the touch as one feels a fly on the back of the hand in a dream, the candlelight on his wife's throat, the angle of her shoulders neither stiff nor loose. The Duke's mouth moving, slow, careful, shaping a sentence that made her look down at her plate, and then, after a measured pause, look up again with the smallest, most private smile Adrian had ever seen on her face. He had been married to that mouth for 4 years. He had never once put that smile on it. The thought arrived without permission, and sat down at his table like an uninvited guest. Morel was saying something about the soup. Myrel was always saying something. He answered in the right places, with the right warmth, because he had built his career and his reputation and the very mask he wore to dinner on the discipline of answering in the right places with the right warmth. Inside, behind the careful face, a slow, cold question was forming. How long had his wife known he came here? How long had she known about the private dining room at the back of the Argent Heron, the table he always took on Wednesdays, the cut flowers Morel insisted upon? How long had she known, and how long had she said nothing? And what exactly was she telling him now by sitting in the front room of the same establishment with the most powerful man in 3 provinces and refusing, with that unbothered hand on the linen? She would not look up. He understood that almost at once. Eleanor was not a woman who failed to notice anything. She was a woman who chose, each moment, what to notice and what to leave alone. She had chosen the Duke's face. She had chosen the white tablecloth and the small silver bowl of candied violets, and the way the candle flame leaned a little toward her breath when she spoke. She had not chosen him. He turned his eyes back to Morel. Before Morel could notice they had been elsewhere, he smiled. He asked her in a low voice whether the wine was to her liking. He listened to her opinion of the wine as a man listens to rain at a window he cannot close, and under the table, very slowly, he closed his hand into a fist, and then, with effort, opened it again. To understand what was happening in that dining room, you must understand a marriage that had been arranged before either party was old enough to refuse it. Eleanor Hartwin had been 17 when her father, drowning quietly in debt no one outside 3 counting houses knew about, had walked her into a drawing room in the city and introduced her to the only son of Lord Vesh of Brindamere, a young man 2 years her senior, with a brilliant mind for trade, an unreadable face, and the kind of cold composure that some women find restful and others find frightening. Eleanor had found it neither. She had found it interesting, which was, in her family, a rarer and more useful reaction. They had been married within the year. The contract was generous on his side and discreet on hers. The debts vanished from the counting houses as quietly as ink lifted from a page, and no one outside 3 rooms in the city ever spoke of them again. She had brought him her composure, her cleverness, and a dowry of properties along the eastern coast that her father had never managed to make profitable, and that her husband, within 18 months, had turned into the most lucrative shipping concession in the southern reach. He had brought her his name, his houses, his careful manners, and a habit of working late that she had at first mistaken for diligence. They had agreed, in the early months, on a great many things. They had agreed on the management of the household, on the seating of guests, on the education of the niece he had taken in after his sister's death, on the necessity of attending the season in town, and the equal necessity of leaving it before it became tedious. They had agreed on the shape of their days. They had not agreed, because they had never spoken of it, on the shape of their nights. Eleanor was not a romantic. She had been raised by a mother who taught her that romance was a luxury for women whose fathers had not gambled, and she had absorbed the lesson without bitterness. But she discovered, slowly, capable of a steady, attentive affection she had not expected of herself, and she had begun, in the second year of the marriage, to direct that affection cautiously toward her husband. Or, if he had noticed, he had not known what to do with it, and had treated it as one treats a gift one is not certain one has earned, with thanks, with care, with a faint, polite distance that made the giver in time stop giving. By the third year, she had stopped. By the fourth, she had learned to be amused by the household and useful to it, and she had taught herself not to wait at the window when his carriage was late. By the time she discovered she was with child, she had also discovered, through a maid who could not keep a secret and a milliner who could, that her husband had taken a mistress. She did not weep. She did not write a letter. She did not, as her mother would have done, lock herself in a small room with a small dog and a large bottle, and emerge 3 days later with red eyes and a new gown ordered. She sat, very still, at the writing desk in the morning room, and she thought, for the better part of an afternoon. And, what she decided, by the time the light had turned the color of weak tea on the lawn outside, was that she would not behave as the wronged wife behaves, because the wronged wife was the part of the story everyone in the city had already written for her, and Eleanor Vesh had long since stopped agreeing to play parts written by other people. She would behave instead as a woman behaves, who has been underestimated by her own husband, which is to say, she would behave precisely as she had always behaved, and she would notice the Wednesdays. She would notice the flowers ordered from the florist on Maple Row. She would notice the new cufflinks, the unexplained accounts, the smell of an unfamiliar perfume on a coat collar, when he came in late and kissed the top of her head and asked with absent kindness whether she had eaten. She would notice all of it, and she would say nothing, not because she was afraid, not because she was ashamed, but because saying nothing, in the household of Lord Adrian Vesh, was the single most powerful instrument a clever woman could play, and she had been learning the fingering of it for 4 years. The Duke of Marinwall was an old acquaintance of her uncle's. He had written to her, in the careful, slightly old-fashioned hand he used for personal correspondence, when he heard she was expecting a child. He had asked, with the directness that had earned him both his friends and his enemies, whether she might allow him the pleasure of dining with her the next time he was in town. As he had business he wished to discuss with her, and he preferred to discuss business across a good table rather than across a desk. Eleanor had read the letter twice. She had folded it. She had placed it in the small lacquered box where she kept her private papers, the box her husband had never thought to look inside, because her husband had never quite understood that his wife had private papers at all, and she had written back, in the same careful hand, that she would be delighted to meet him at the Argent Heron on the Wednesday following his arrival at the hour of 8. She had chosen the day. She had chosen the establishment. She had chosen the front room with its lilies and its violins and its clear, unimpeded line of sight to the doorway at the back. She had chosen, with a calm that surprised even her, the dress, a dove-gray silk that draped softly over the rounded curve of her belly and made no apology for it. And when she stepped down from the carriage that evening on the arm of the Duke's footman, she had glanced, just once, up at the high front windows of the restaurant, and she had said to herself, quite clearly in the voice she used when she was making a decision, she did not intend to take back. Tonight, he sees me. Inside the front room, the Duke had risen as she entered. He was a tall man, broad in the shoulder, gray at the temples, with the still face of someone who had spent decades being watched and had decided long ago not to perform for it. He took her hand in the formal way, bowed over it the precisely correct distance, and pulled out her chair himself, waving away the maître d' with a small, courteous gesture that made the maître de beau more deeply than he had intended. Eleanor sat, the Duke sat, the waiter brought water and bread, and the small silver bowl of candied violets that the house was famous for, and went away. For a long moment the Duke did not speak. He looked at her. Not at her belly, which would have been intrusive, and not past her, which would have been rude, but at her face, with a steady, considering attention that Eleanor realized, with a small jolt, she had not received from a man across a dinner table in a very long time. Then he said, in a voice pitched low enough that only she could hear it, "I am told your husband is at the back of the house tonight. I thought you should know, in case you wish to leave." Eleanor took a slow sip of water. She set the glass down. She met the Duke's eyes. "I know," she said. "I chose Wednesday." The Duke's mouth moved very slightly at one corner. It was not quite a smile. It was the beginning of one, paused there, like a man pausing on a threshold to see whether he has been invited in. Then, with the same low courtesy, he said, "In that case, my lady, shall we order?" The conversation that followed was, on its surface, a conversation about land. The Duke had inherited, 2 years before, a stretch of marsh and woodland along the eastern coast which his factors had assured him was worthless. He had reason to believe his factors were mistaken. He had been making inquiries. He had heard, through channels he did not name, that the shipping concession that ran the coast immediately south of his marshland was managed in practice not by Lord Vesh, whose name was on the papers, but by Lady Vesh, whose name was on nothing. He wished, he said, to understand whether what he had heard was true. He wished to understand it from her, because the men who had told him had been guessing, and he preferred not to do business on the basis of guesses. Eleanor listened. She ate, slowly, because the child made it necessary to eat slowly. She watched his hands as he spoke, large hands, very still, the hands of a man who had learned not to gesture. When he had finished, she set down her fork, and she said quite simply that what he had heard was true, and that she would be glad to explain to him precisely how the concession worked, and precisely why his marshland, properly drained on the southern edge, and would, within 5 years, be worth more than the rest of his estate combined. She spoke for 20 minutes. She did not refer to a single paper. She named tides and depths, and the names of 3 captains who would, if approached correctly, bring their ships north for half the fee the Duke was currently paying men who would not. She named the precise width, in feet, of the channel that would have to be cut through the western dike. She named the cost. She named the return. She did not raise her voice. She did not at any point look toward the back of the house. When she had finished, the Duke was silent for a long moment. Then he set his own fork down, and he said in a voice that was for the first time not entirely composed, "My lady, I came here tonight to ask you a question, and you have answered 3 I had not yet thought to ask." He paused. He looked at her very steadily. Then he said, "Your husband is a fool." Eleanor did not answer. She picked up her glass of water again. She turned it a quarter turn on the cloth, as if adjusting a small instrument. And then, without looking at him, without looking anywhere in particular, she said, in the same calm voice she had used to discuss the channel through the western dike, "He is not a fool, Your Grace." He is simply a man who has never had to look. At the back of the house, behind the screen of lilies, Adrian had stopped pretending to listen to Morel. He had stopped pretending to eat. He sat with his hands folded on the edge of the table, and he watched his wife speak to a man who was watching her as if she were the only living person in the room. And he understood, slowly, the way one understands the meaning of a sentence in a language one has only partly learned. That something was being arranged in the front room of the Argent Heron that had nothing to do with him, and that he had, by his own long inattention, made himself unnecessary to it. Meryl, sensing at last that she had lost him, leaned closer. Her perfume, which she had once found charming, struck him now as too sweet. The sweetness of something left out too long. "Adrian," she said, in the low, coaxing voice she had perfected, "is something the matter?" He looked at her. He looked at her properly, perhaps for the first time in 3 months, and what he saw, with a small, cold clarity that surprised him, was a woman who was not unkind and not stupid, and not in any meaningful sense his. She was a habit. She was a habit he had built carefully around the edges of a marriage he had not bothered to inhabit, and the habit, like all habits, had begun to wear a groove in him so deep he had mistaken it for a road. He said, quite gently, "Nothing is the matter." He said, "The wine is excellent." He said, "Will you forgive me? I think I have a headache coming on." And Meryl, who was many things but not a woman who pressed when she sensed a closing door, smiled the practiced smile she kept for such moments, and said, "Of course, my lord," and called with the smallest lift of her gloved hand, "For the bill." He paid, he stood, he helped her into her wrap, he walked her, by the side door, to her waiting carriage, he kissed her gloved hand, he told her, with the courtesy he had been raised to, that he would call upon her later in the week. He stood on the cobbles in the lamplight and watched her carriage pull away. And then, instead of climbing into his own, he turned, slowly, and walked back into the Argent Heron through the front door. The maître d' saw him. The maître d's face did a complicated, almost ballet-ic thing in which surprise, calculation, and professional neutrality all briefly contested for the upper hand, and professional neutrality won. He bowed. He asked Lord Veche whether he was meeting someone. Lord Veche said quietly that he was meeting his wife. The maître d' bowed again. He led him, with the unhurried steps of a man leading a guest to a table he has not, in fact, reserved across the front room, heads turned, very slightly, behind fans and over wine glasses. Eleanor did not turn. She had heard, Adrian was certain, the maître d's voice, and she had heard her own name, and she had heard the footsteps approaching her table, and she did not turn. She set down her glass of water. She placed her hands on the linen, one on either side of her plate, as if steadying the world again, and only when his shadow fell across the cloth did she look up. She looked up at him without surprise. That was the thing that struck him first. She looked up at him the way one looks up at a guest who has arrived precisely when one expected him, and a little later than one had hoped. "Eleanor," he said. She inclined her head. "Lord Veche," she said, "may I present His Grace the Duke of Marenwal." The Duke rose. The Duke offered his hand. The Duke said, with the very faint, very controlled coolness of a man who has spent the last hour learning to dislike the husband of a woman he has been speaking with, "Lord Veche, we have not met." Adrian took the hand. He bowed the precisely correct distance. He said, "Your Grace." He felt, with great clarity, the silence of the room around them, and he felt, with even greater clarity, the silence at the table itself, which was a different and much older silence. A silence that had been growing between him and his wife for the better part of 4 years, and that had now, in this lamplit room, in front of a man he did not know, finally found its full height. He sat. The Duke, after a small, considering pause, sat also. Eleanor said, in the calm voice she used at dinner parties, that she'd trusted the back room had been satisfactory. Adrian said, after a beat that it had been, she said, with the smallest possible smile, that she was glad. The Duke, watching them both, said nothing. The waiter, with the inspired instinct of a man who has worked the front room of the Argent Heron for 20 years, materialized with a fresh glass and a small silver knife. He set them down. He vanished. Adrian looked at his wife. He looked at the hand resting on the linen, the hand he had not held in a meaningful way in, he did not know how long. He looked at the curve of her belly under the gray silk, and he understood, with a clarity that hurt him low in the chest, that he had been about to lose something he had never quite let himself notice he had. He said, in a voice pitched only for her, Eleanor, we should speak. She did not look away from him. We are speaking, she said. He said, somewhere private. She considered him for a long moment. The candlelight moved on her throat. The Duke, very deliberately, lifted his glass and turned slightly toward the window, granting them the only privacy the room could offer. And Eleanor, in the same calm voice, said, "When His Grace and I have finished our dinner, my lord, you may follow my carriage home. We will speak there." He understood, in the way she said it, that there would be no scene. There would be no shouting, there would be no broken porcelain. There would be a conversation in a quiet room, and at the end of that conversation, his life would be one of two things, and which of the two it became would depend entirely on what he said in the next several hours, and on whether what he said was, for once in their marriage, true. He bowed his head. Very slightly he said, "Thank you." He rose. He bowed to the Duke. He walked with the composed gait of a man who has been raised never to hurry across a public room to the front door, and he stepped out into the cold air of the street, and he stood for a long time under the lamp, breathing. The carriage came an hour later. He heard it before he saw it. The soft clop of the bays, the rattle of the lacquered wheels on the cobbles, the low murmur of the coachman quieting the horses. He saw the Duke hand his wife in. He saw the Duke bow over her hand and say something to her quietly that made her nod once. He saw the Duke step back. He saw the carriage door close. He climbed into his own carriage. He told the driver to follow. They drove through the cold streets of the city, past the closed shutters of the shops on Maple Row, past the dark windows of the great houses on the square, past the small lit windows of the night porters and the sleepless, and he watched the back of his wife's carriage and he thought about every Wednesday of the last 3 months, and about how strange it was that a man could believe himself the architect of his own life and discover, in the space of one dinner, that he had been a tenant in it, paying late, and noticed only by the landlady. They reached the house. He helped her down himself. The footman, who had clearly been instructed, stepped back without a word. He gave her his arm. She took it, lightly, the way one takes the arm of a man one does not entirely trust on a slippery step. They climbed the stairs together. They passed the great hall with its banked fire, and the morning room with its writing desk, and they went, by unspoken agreement, into the small library at the end of the gallery, the room where, in the first year of their marriage, they had once sat up until 2 in the morning over a map of the eastern coast, planning the future of an estate they had not yet inherited. He had not been in this room with her in over a year. The fire had been lit. The decanter had been set out. The 2 chairs by the hearth had been turned, very slightly toward each other, in the way one turns chairs for a difficult conversation. Eleanor went to the chair on the left. She sat. She rested her hands on the arms of the chair. She looked at him. He sat opposite her. He did not reach for the decanter. He did not, in fact, know what to do with his hands. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The fire moved. A log shifted. Somewhere in the house, very faintly, a clock struck the half-hour. Then Eleanor said, in the same calm voice she had used at dinner, "I am not going to ask you about her. He did not at first understand. He looked at her. He understood. He bowed his head. She said, "I know about her. I have known about her since the second Wednesday. I know her name. I know where she lives. I know what you spend on her in a month, because the household accounts pass through me. And I have not pretended otherwise to myself. I am not going to ask you to explain. There is nothing you could say that would explain it to me in a way I would believe, and I would rather you not lie to me in this room," he said hoarsely. Eleanor. She held up a hand. "Not yet," she said. He stopped. She said, "What I am going to ask you is this." She paused. She drew a long, slow breath. She placed her hand lightly on the curve of her belly, not for effect, but in the way she had begun, in the last 2 months, to place it there whenever she needed to remember that she was not alone in any room she stood in. She said, "When this child is born, what kind of father do you intend to be?" He stared at her. He had been braced for accusation. He had been braced for tears. He had been braced for the cold, controlled fury he half believed she had been saving up for 4 years. He had not been braced for that question. He opened his mouth. He closed it. He looked for the first time in a long time, properly at her. He saw, in the lamplight, the faint shadow under her eyes that had been there for months and that he had not noticed. He saw the way her hand rested on the child. He saw the steady, patient, unyielding attention with which she was waiting for his answer, and he understood that she was not asking him a rhetorical question, and she was not asking it to wound him. She was asking it because she had already made her own decision about what kind of mother she intended to be, and she required, before she went any further, to know whether there was a place for him in the life she was building or whether she was going to build it without him. He said very quietly, "I do not know." She nodded, as if that at least were honest. She said, "Then I will tell you what I know." She said, "I know that I am going to raise this child to be steady and observant and unafraid of silence. I know that I am going to teach this child that the world is full of people who will underestimate them, and that the proper response to being underestimated is not to perform for the people who do it, but to quietly become the thing they cannot afford to lose. I know that I would prefer this child to have a father who can stand in the same room with that lesson without feeling diminished by it." She paused. The fire moved. She said, "I do not know whether you are that man. I have hoped, in some part of myself I had stopped consulting, that you might be. I have not seen evidence of it. I am willing, if you wish, to look for evidence with you. I am not willing to wait politely while you decide whether to look." He sat very still. He thought, with sudden and almost unbearable clarity, of the night 4 years ago when she had walked into the drawing room on her father's arm, and he had looked across the room and thought, "That is a face I could spend a life looking at." And then, in the slow, careful manner he had been raised in, he said, "Eleanor." She waited. He said, "The Duke." She tilted her head very slightly in inquiry. He said, "Was tonight the first time?" She considered him. She said, "Yes." She said, "His Grace wrote to me a month ago about a business matter. I chose the day. I chose the restaurant. I chose the front room. I did not invite him to expose you. I invited him because his proposal was sound, and because I wished, for once in our marriage, to sit across a dinner table from a man who was looking at me." She paused. She said, "That is not a confession, my lord. That is a description." He nodded. He understood. He said quietly, "Will you see him again?" She said, "On business." "Yes, the proposal is excellent. I intend to accept it on the terms we discussed," he said, "and otherwise." She held his gaze. "Otherwise," she said, "depends on what we decide in this room." They sat for a long time. The fire moved. Somewhere in the house, the clock struck again. He thought of Morel and of the carriage he had handed her into earlier that night, and of the practiced smile she had given him. And he understood with the cold simplicity of a ledger ruled at the end of a year, that he had been spending the small currency of his attention on a woman who would never miss it, and withholding the large currency of it from a woman who had stopped some time ago asking. He said, "I will end it tomorrow, by letter, and then in person. I will close the account at the florist. I will not see her again. I will tell my factor to stop paying the rent on the rooms." Eleanor said nothing. He said, "I know that is not enough. I know that ending a thing is not the same as building a thing. I know that you are not asking me what I will stop doing. You are asking me what I will start." She inclined her head very slightly. He said, "I have not been a husband. I have been a name in a contract. I have done well by the contract and badly by the marriage, and I have told myself for 4 years that the one was the other." He paused. He said, "I should like, if you will allow me, to learn how to be the other." He said, "I do not know how." He said, "I am willing to be taught." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, very gently, "I am not your teacher, Adrian. I am your wife." He bowed his head. She said, "But I am willing to be in the same room while you learn." He let out a breath he had not realized he had been holding. It was not, he understood, forgiveness. Forgiveness was a larger thing, and a slower one, and it would have to be earned in 1,000 small rooms like this one, over 1,000 small evenings by 1,000 small acts of paying attention. It was permission. It was permission to begin. Outside, the city was quiet. Inside, the fire moved. Eleanor reached out, after a moment, and laid her hand, lightly, on the arm of his chair. Not on his hand, not yet. On the arm of his chair in the small, neutral place where her hand could rest without committing either of them to anything more than the fact of being in the same room. He looked at her hand. He did not move his own. He understood that he had not yet earned the right to. He understood that the discipline of not reaching in this moment was the first lesson. They sat that way, in the small library at the end of the gallery, until the fire had burned down to embers, and the clock had struck the next hour, and the child inside her, which had been still all evening, stirred, very faintly, under the dove-gray silk, and Eleanor's hand on the arm of his chair tightened, very slightly, and then relaxed. She smiled almost to herself, at something she did not share. And Adrian, watching her smile at something she did not share, understood that the work of his life, from this evening forward, would be the slow, patient, possibly lifelong work of becoming a man with whom she might one day be willing to share it. The child was born on a morning in early spring, in a room full of pale light and the smell of fresh linen, and was a daughter. They named her Iris, for no reason either of them ever fully explained, except that Eleanor had once, as a girl, sat in a garden full of them and felt, for an afternoon, entirely safe. The Duke of Marinwall sent, by way of congratulation, a small silver cup engraved with the date and a short, courteous note. The marshland to the east of his estate was drained by the channel through the western dike in the 3rd year of Iris's life, and by the 5th was generating an income that the Duke, in a letter that Eleanor kept in the small lacquered box, described as embarrassingly large. Myrell, whose surname need not detain us, married, within the year, a wine merchant from the southern provinces who adored her, and who had, by all accounts, the great good fortune to remain unaware that he was the second man in her life to do so. The maitre d' of the Argent Heron, who had behaved with such inspired discretion on the night in question, was the following spring the surprised recipient of a generous and entirely anonymous gift, and retired 3 years later to a small house on the coast where, it was said, he kept a cellar that would have done credit to a much grander establishment. The household accounts of Vesh House, which had passed in practice through Eleanor's hands for 4 years, passed through them officially from the date of Iris's first birthday, and the ledgers, which had always been admirably kept, became, under her formal stewardship, the quiet marvel of 3 counting houses. Adrian, who had once been described by a rival as the coldest mind in the Southern Reach, became, by degrees, so slow that even his closest associates did not at first notice. A man who left his office at a reasonable hour, who could be found on most evenings in the small library at the end of the gallery. Dark-haired girl who corrected his pronunciation with great seriousness, and who, when his wife entered the room, looked up with the expression of a man who had, after long study, finally begun to understand a sentence he had been mistranslating for years. They were not, in the end, a romantic couple. They were something rarer, and to those who knew them well, more enviable. 2 clever people who had agreed in a small library on a winter night to begin paying attention to each other, and who had then, with the patience that such agreements require, done so. And if, on certain Wednesdays, Eleanor still dined at the Argent Heron, in the front room, in a chair by the window, it was now her husband who sat across from her, and it was now her husband who watched her face with the steady, considering attention of a man who had, very nearly, lost the privilege of doing so, and who did not intend, for as long as he lived, to lose it again. And so, if you have ever sat at a table where you were not being seen, and chosen, instead of weeping, to dress carefully and sit at another table and let the world catch up with you on its own time, this story has been for you. If you have ever been the one at the other table, the one who looked up too late and understood, in a single lamplit moment, what you had been about to lose, this story has been for you also. Tell me, by the embers of your own fire tonight, which moment stayed with you? The fork paused halfway to his mouth, the hand resting on the white linen, the small smile she did not share, or the hand laid lightly on the arm of the chair. I should very much like to know. And if you have liked sitting here with me by this fire, pull your chair a little closer next time and stay. There will be another story on another evening when the lamps are lit and the world has gone quiet, and I will be here as I am here tonight, glad of your company. Sleep gently, friend, until the next.